So, Gordon, please tell us, how did you come to know International House?
Well, Kelvin, I was in Abidjan. I was playing tennis after hours, and a call came. And the person speaking was the chairman of the executive committee, Jack Howell. And he said, "We want this man, Gordon, to consider the presidency of International House in New York." And my wife, Barbara, who took the call, said, call back. And so he called back. He said, "You have to come right away. We have 12 on the list. Abby O'Neill has been in touch with Don Gonzalez, the executive vice president of Colonial Williamsburg, and he thinks that this retiring couple from the Foreign Service should consider iHouse." So Jack called back. "You have to come immediately." "Won't. We're going to Wales." And my sweater is from, it's 38 years old, and I'm very proud of it. So he said, "I don't think we can keep this open." And I said, "Well, I didn't apply." And so the fact was that he called back and said, "We're going to keep it open. We're going to keep it open until the end of October. And you know why?" And I said, "No." He said, "Because I am of Welsh ancestry also." So we arrive in New York. We drive up Park Avenue to where the O'Neills have an apartment. We have a bicycle in our checkered cab. The man comes out, the concession, and very, very rudely says, "May I help you?" And so we're staying in the O'Neills' apartment. "Oh, yes, let me help you with all your baggage." So we go upstairs, and we're there overnight. And you know, the O'Neills are devout Baptists. And there's a note that the key to the liquor cabinet is in George's pocket of his tuxedo. And so that was it. The next day we go to the Rainbow Room and we have lunch. And Jack Howell, the chairman of the committee, says, "I don't think Abby is going to come because she's way out on Long Island." And we were sitting down, in she walks. So at the end of the luncheon, things must have gone well. I heard her look at the trustees and nod her head, and we knew we were in.
Excellent. What attracted you to the position? Did you know about iHouse before? What attracted you?
No, in fact, my father called after this was known and said, "Gordon, why are you joining the International House of Pancakes?" and so, no, I did a lot of reading. I did a lot of reading about it, and so I had to learn a lot. And as you know, you come in, and you need to be somewhat prepared. We were up in Interlaken, where we were planning on settling, for about 3 weeks and didn't hear anything. And I thought, you know, maybe they've looked into my background and found something that was upsetting. And I told you that 6 months later, we were sued for a project in Guinea. And if that had come before, we would have been off the list. Yeah. So the more I read about it, the more exciting it was. And so I arrived, and the Tom Olson, the little in-betweener between Howard Cook and myself, said, "You know, Gordon, these residents are like a herd, and you'll get trampled." Yeah. So that was my introduction. So that was about it.
So how would you describe International House during your time period? A lot of people think of it as like an international dormitory.
Yeah.
But it's not just an international dormitory. So what is it?
Let me mention a number of things. One would be the cultural hours. And we would have them, I noticed that maybe twice a semester. We would have them maybe every third week. And the cultural hour was very, very important. Two things come to mind. The Germans, when they gave their cultural hour, they would pause 5 minutes in respect to what went on during World War II and during the Nazi Hitler period. everyone was quiet. There would be hundreds in the main lounge, and year after year, when the German Cultural Hour occurred, this would occur, and that to me was a wonderful way of the moral insight of the young in Germany. The other was we invited someone we had met indirectly to come. She had spent a third of her life in Germany, a third of her life in Israel, and a third of her life in the United States. And she was married to someone who had made a fortune in Canadian ore. And she attended the Israeli Cultural Hour, which was run by women, with the women residents. And they were very critical of Israel in regard to the women's role in Israel, very critical. She went home, called me the next morning, and said, "You're in my will." When she passed away a year later, she left $100,000 to the international. So those are two. Now, in terms of other aspects of what was so wonderful are the active residents. And I would say originally of the 500 before we bought Van Dusen, there'd be maybe 150 to 200 that would do various things, security, run programs, etc. Many of them worked long enough that they paid no rent at all. In other words, it's a wash transaction, and so one group said, "Gordon, we need a new telephone system." So we worked on the design of that, and it was installed. And it turned out, I don't know to this day how it happened, that when someone made a long-distance call, it was charged to the international house, not to them. And so they were delighted with the telephone system. Another was the orchestra. We set up an orchestra for 2 years, and the director of that said, "Oh, we'll raise all sorts of money, and you won't have to worry." He raised not $1. So after 2 years, it ended, and I was criticized for ending that. We launched the Women's Leadership Program, and Pat Cloherty, among others, was very, very important in that, and I think she's still a trustee. And so that was a way in which women residents in part of the leadership program would tie into a senior executive in a enterprise in New York City, and it's gone on up, and it's still functioning, and was very. The Harlem tutorial was a little bit sluggish, and we activated it, and as you know, I spent 10 years in West Africa, and our favorite country is Ghana, which was wonderful. So those are some of the interactions with residents.
What do you say is the secret to the success of International House? In other words, you take a lot of people from different places, make them live together, and suddenly their minds start to open up.
Yeah.
Is that organic, or is it also fueled by the programs that one has, or the way the building is structured? How does this happen? Because that's the major impact, is to open up their minds, right?
I think, I don't know, Calvin, I think that probably 80% of the residents have a life-changing experience. The other 20% I won't focus on are here because it's a cheap place to live and it's available to them. But that 80%, you see it as you go, in, for example, the World Council. We had meetings in Berlin, we had meetings in Tokyo, we had meetings in New Delhi, and many, many meetings here. And the alumni would come forth. And these would be years and years and years after they left the house. And so I think the transformation in part, in some cases comes very quickly, in some cases comes more slowly. Yeah.
And these residents continue to have these values for the rest of their life. How are they really changed for the rest of their lives?
I think some are. I think some are. I think the focus in our culture is on greed. It's on high incomes. It's on starting out with $120,000 a year salary from here. And I think those are flowed into the 1% very quickly and maybe are not that concerned. But the majority, I think, are changed for life. I think there is a sense that this is one of the richest experiences that they'll ever have.
Well put. Do you have any stories of specific residents that you remember being changed or having an impact or from your time here?
Oh, many, many. I'll just mention two. One is a fellow by the name of Anderson, and he and his partner flew up to Interlaken to see us. The telephone system was designed by Anderson, and in fact, he probably got a commission for having people call long distance free. But we often would prepare meals, maybe 10 times in our 11 years up in our apartment. And he and his colleague, Roger Jallis. Now, Roger Jallis is a multimillionaire I think in Belgium, maybe in Germany. And so those two were very, very important. They gave seminars. They did much design. In fact, Roger, we had a radio station for 1 year before we were put out of business, but it was only for International House, and Roger was the one that designed it. I could go on, but those would be two examples.
Very good ones.
Mm-hmm.
What about international events that happened during your time here, and what was the reaction to them here at International House,
Yeah.
especially if there was something like a conflict between two nations,
Yeah.
and those two nations had residents here? How did the residents deal with that?
Well, we'll start with Israel's invasion of Lebanon. We had someone from, I think, Syria, maybe Saudi Arabia, who had, at that time, this was in the 80s, a phone that was powerful. And he was in touch with what was going on. And so we had out in the lounge, we had a group of residents that were from Israel, from Lebanon, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia. And every day at an appointed hour, I think it was 3 in the afternoon, there would be a progress report of what was going on. That was one. Another was when Turkey and Greece were fighting over Cyprus. We had a group of Turkish residents, I think two from Greece. We invited them up to the apartment. We prepared meals together, and there was, I think, a friendship over conflict. A third one was when we first bombed Libya. You may remember that no country would permit us to fly over them, and so we had to go down through the Mediterranean. General Walters was the ambassador to the UN. It became known he was going to speak. So there was a group from Colombia outside preventing him to come. We brought him in through the Van Dusen garage, or the north garage, and put him up through the kitchen elevator, and he spoke. And one thing I remember in regard to this conflict, there was a resident that stood up and read something, kept on reading. He said, "Just a moment, I'm the one that's been asked to speak. By the way, who wrote that for you?"
That's great. We've had that too with Henry Kissinger. We had, I think, several hundred
Outside.
residents who did not want him to come in. Talk about that too in terms of what is the kind of political climate inside iHouse. In other words, is it a place, especially under your tenure, where all opinions were open and you didn't really put up with people who tried to quash free speech?
I'll start with one event that took place in this room. When Henry would come to iHouse, we would always start with a group of 50 that would be drawn by lottery. So he comes in, and before that, my wife said, when the former Secretary of State comes in, you stand. So they all stood up. Before he got really into his talk, an Indian lady with a beautiful sari and all sorts of jewelry stood up and said, "I think America's democracy is a sham." And Henry said, "Are you talking about India's democracy, or are you talking about America's democracy?" And she said, "Of course, America's democracy. How long have you been here?" "Well, I came 6 weeks ago." "Please sit down. You need more time." Yeah. So that was one event. I would mention, may I say a few things about Henry? When I first joined, they had arranged the New York Times, your old buddies, to have a representative there. And Henry starts out with, because I was there when he came over to be Secretary of State, it was in the courtyard in the State Department, and he started out by saying, Gordon? I said, yes. No one worked for Henry Kissinger twice. That was the start of our discussion. He would, after a board meeting, and he maybe came every other board meeting, he would give a 15-minute sort of appraisal of what was going on in the world. And knowing that he was going to be chair, and some people called in and says, Henry coming to chair this board meeting? It would be packed. And then finally, he was walking down Park Avenue, and I was on the other side, and I called over and I said, hello, Henry. And I got a phone call that afternoon. He was on the line. He said, never recognize me in public. So that was Henry. And he was...
well, why didn't he want you to recognize him in public?
I guess security. He still had, Richard Nixon never, he gave up his security. I guess he felt sufficiently guilty for his sins, but Gerald Ford and Henry had significant. And Henry Kissinger resigned from the board because he felt he was hurting International House by what was coming to the fore in regard to Vietnam.
Why do you think International House was able to attract such important and significant and even controversial figures to serve on its board?
Because this is the most important institution in New York, without exception. Yeah. I think also the tradition. Wickersham was the first chairman of the board. He came aboard in 1922. He saw all the construction. He was the former Attorney General for William Howard Taft, and he stayed on for another 10 years. And then you had George Marshall, who was on. Eisenhower agreed to be a chair when he was at Columbia. He came over a couple times. One time he made a tour of the House. It was that nature. But I think that the rock bottom was that the Rockefellers and the Dodges were committed from day one. They, to this day, you have both a Rockefeller and you have a Dodge actively involved in International House. And I think that is the issue. Anyone that gets to know, for example, I thought we were going to lose President Ford when we didn't pay him. He would become pro bono. He fell in love with this place. He really, and as I said, he attended 12 of the 13 board meetings, even though he had to come from California or Colorado. And his secretary, who I became very fond, we talked to a lot, was called Penny Circle. Yeah. And then, if I may touch on John Whitehead, I think the fact that David Rockefeller called him, Henry Kissinger called him, Abby called him, but I think also when he came out to look over the house, we had to meet with the Residence Council in the Dodge room. I didn't say anything, which is difficult, and they interacted and they were articulate and persuasive. And as we walked out through the beautiful main lounge, he said, "This is quite a place." I said, "Have you decided?" "I'll think it over." Yeah.
What has given you the most, what was the most fulfilling, maybe there's several fulfilling moments or events or times for you here at International House?
Here, I guess growing close to residents. I had residents who were really depressed, some so depressed that we had to get counseling involved. This was in the mid-'80s. The LPGT was just launching. I had a number who came and talked about their situation. And there, I would sit in the lounge and there would be a few residents that would trickle in. I also had public meetings where I was chastised rather vigorously by residents for this or that. In fact, I mentioned to you that one resident at our retreat said, Gordon, when are you going to charge to run the elevators? So the interaction with residents, being pretty close to, as close as you can get, I think, possibly, to the board chairs. I would meet with each of them to go over the agenda. I became very fond of the chair of the executive committee, Steve Ayer, who was jettisoned from Citibank because they were involved in some inappropriate financial maneuvers, and he was sacrificed. He was wise. He also was ascorbic. He would comment on my posture. We were negotiating the purchase of Van Dusen Hall downtown, and it was very tense. And speaking of posture, I fell out of my chair on the floor, and then people laughed and broke. I didn't do it purposely, yeah. So I think that would be another. And then being with the speakers, as Walter Wriston, as I mentioned, came. The Fortune 500. There were 17 either chairs or CEOs that came to speak, which John Whitehead launched. And half of them were introduced by Nancy Dickerson, John Whitehead's wife. She was the first woman in network broadcasting. And boy, could she do an introduction. Yeah, she was. So it was interaction with speakers also that we had Bishop Tutu. I need to mention that we started, well, first of all, how did we get Bishop Tutu? We got Bishop Tutu because we had the residents, right? And he was down at General Theological, I think, on the Hudson River. And he came, and so we had dinner. And there were 22 of us, as I remember. And he said, before we break bread, let's hold hands. And it was almost as if Jesus was sitting in the chair. And when he spoke, he said, here is my passport. It says, place of birth unknown. He said, I know where I was born. He said, why did they do this? And as you know, he was a peacemaker, and the transition under the circumstances was really very well done. One last thing, the ambassador to Ghana, an African-American from Colorado, he was director of the Peace Corps or vice president of the Peace Corps with Sarge Shriver for Africa. He came out, and he was there until maybe, 67, maybe 60, and he resigned because of the Vietnam War. He didn't agree with it. When he died at Midtown Ethical Culture at the auditorium, Bishop Tutu came. And Bishop Tutu stood up and said, Frank's father said, Frank, would you please improve your argument and lower your voice? And that was, so that's a side piece, but it was also related to a speaker, Bishop Tutu, who I think is one of the most powerful individuals in terms of his morals and in terms of the breadth of his understanding and his ability to forgive.
What's it like being the president of what is essentially almost a United Nations or Tower of Babel, and what served you best? Because it can be quite challenging, as you pointed out, having 500 arrested bright young people from 100 countries.
Yeah.
What prepared you for the job, and what served you best in the job?
I'm not sure anything prepared me, although we did live on 3 continents. We were Fulbrighters in Oslo, and that's where we were married, and then we were in South Asia for 8 years, and West Africa for 10 wonderful years. So we had that background, and normally of those 5 countries, 6 countries, if you include Norway, we would always have a special bond with those students, and so that was one form of preparation, was that bond. Another is you have to be a glutton for punishment. And even though we're dealing with maybe now 700 students, and it's just a modest budget compared to, say, Columbia. There's still stress, and there can be. And I had staff that were not particularly. I had a couple molds, and it's hard to know that someone is ratting on you almost monthly, and yet try to maintain a friendship with them. And leadership is something I think that you can learn, but maybe innate. I would consider myself a good president, but not a great president. I would say Howard Cook, Don Cuneo, Calvin Sims are great presidents, but I think by and large, acceptable.
So talk a little bit, and then we'll get to the acquisition of iHouse North. But if you could talk a little bit some more about the trustees, and I'm curious about David Rockefeller, who you also worked with when he was the chair. Tell me about working with David Rockefeller and what you thought of him and how it was to work with him.
Well, he was chair of the executive committee before I arrived. David Rockefeller was a friend that I actively cultivated, but not aggressively. So how can you do that, actively and not be aggressive? It's a technique that you know, and I learned. So I would make it a point, maybe every 6 months, every 4 months, to call on him, and you go to Rockefeller Center, you sit there and you listen. Then he sort of bought in to the Evanses, and we got invited to many events that the only reason we got invited was that he put our name on the list. And so in terms of board meetings, he was not there, but his niece, Abby O'Neill, who is the reason we ended up here, she was very much there. And a very interesting thing about the Rockefellers, as you know, I just did a tour of Cleveland where we lived at Oberlin, very close to Cleveland, on Wednesday. And the Rockefeller name came up, and there's a building with the Rockefellers. But there's a humility that's involved, and it's innate, and it was certainly passed on to Abby. And Abby would have been the granddaughter of John D. Rockefeller Jr., who, as you know, the first year at Brown, so many people made fun of him that he had a nervous breakdown and had to stay out for a year. And so she was, for us, just wonderful. And I had a trustee or two that you know so well that would have been delighted to have us pack up and leave, but they would not tackle with Abby O'Neill. And every now and then she'd call, and for example, I was spending time on Sakura Park because the Crown Prince was coming, and so we wanted to make sure he came into this room, and which he did. And she said, Gordon, spend less time on Sakura Park and more time on International House. That's about the only time she was, or she would call and say, you know, Gordon, when are you taking your next vacation? So I think that she was a delight. She did not want to form leadership. She would not chair the executive committee. She had Katusha Davidson. Her husband was head of U.S. Trust, as you know. In fact, I was with Katusha in their apartment when he came back when the stock market crashed. I think that in terms of relationships, she was the most important. Bill Sharwell was, who became president of Pace University. He was a mentor. He took me aside and said, make sure, Gordon, that any good idea that you think does not come from you, but comes from the board member. Yeah. So I would plant various. We had opposition to even spending time finding Gerald Ford. We had opposition to taking on a major burden, $18 million for Van Dusen. We had opposition for some of the speakers I invited. For example, the issue of Israel is very sensitive, but I never would have someone from Israel speak without having someone from Palestine speak. And sometimes that got a little dicey. Yeah.
The acquisition of Van Dusen, which we now
Yeah.
call iHouse North.
Yes.
Tell us how that came about and why you pursued it so vigorously, because it is a key event in the history of the house.
One reason I pursued it vigorously is I was told to. And Steve Eyre, as I say, was 10 of the years he was the chair of the executive committee. Let me say a word or two about Pitt Van Dusen because it's important. Henry Coffin was the president of Union Theological Seminary for many, many years. He was William Sloane Coffin's uncle. He had a tremendous impact on William Sloane Coffin. As William Sloane Coffin spoke here 2 or 3 times, and we dined together somewhat frequently. We joined Riverside Church the week that his son was drowned in the Charles River, as you know. But Pitt had big shoes to fill because Henry Coffin was very, very popular. And so he was president from 1945 to 1963. And when Dr. Bennett came to replace him, Van Dusen had done the work, had purchased the land from the Rockefellers, unbeknownst that there was a clause there, the right, and so in '63, in fact, the year that he had stepped down, he stepped down early. Bennett said, "We're going to name the hall after him, after Pitt Van Dusen." So we looked into it. Union in 1987, it was sold in 1987, they sent out a request for a bid to 6 institutions, including Columbia, Teachers College, Barnard, etc. And we were concerned that Columbia was going to buy it, and they would pay big bucks. I think the role that I played might have been helpful. I spent time with Paul Carter, who's still a trustee, and the vice president for management, and through green tea, 3 sessions, they agreed they would not bid. So when Don Schreiber, president of the Union Theological Seminary, wrote a letter, and I mentioned to you, this is a beautiful letter. It's almost like St. Paul's letter to the Romans, that this was a chance that he was so delighted that Jewish Theological Seminary would be able to buy Van Dusen Hall for $15 million. That was the key. Then we knew the price we had to meet, and we had appraisers come in and they said, well, it's on the low side. The land itself was worth $8 million. So it was thanks to Steve, I got in touch with the New York State Dormitory Authority, and after some maneuvering, they agreed that they would loan us $18 million. That was 20 years. In 2008, when it ended, International House had a little over $2 million extra every year in their budget, and that was, but not during that period. So I went over when I was given permission to, and sat down with Don Schreiber, and he said, "I'm sorry, Gordon, but you know, the Jewish Theological Seminary is so delighted to be able to." And I said, "We're going to exercise our right of first refusal." What? And he blew up. He stood up and he just threw a fit and asked me to leave. He never spoke to me again. And I was here from '88 to '93, and so you know what leadership's all about.
Yeah. And why did you want this? Why did you want iHouse North? What was it going to do for iHouse?
Well, it's interesting because I didn't mention that. There were quite a few staff that were opposed to it, and quite a few residents that were opposed to it. So we had a grand meeting out in the auditorium, and I just listened. And I heard all the gripes. It would be overrunning the cafeteria. It just wouldn't be the same place. They're really foreigners because they're in the north, and so we listened. And then I said, you know what? This is the thing we ought to do, because from a budget point of view, it's going to make a world of difference. And we're going to be able to have married couples live there. And we're going to, in fact, what we're going to do, if you approve, now let me listen to you. I said quite a few other things maybe. How do you feel now? Well, all right. Yeah.
And it turned out to be pretty much the biggest boom for our iHouse that we've ever had. Increased the population, allowed for married couples with families to live in the house, and a revenue generator.
Yeah. And I hope that the addition goes forward because, so many human beings that, potential residents that come to Manhattan or come to greater New York that are turned down because there's just not room. And I've had people come into my office who were turned down and cry. Yeah, and so it's in contrast, International Chicago has a real hard time filling its rooms, and it does not only accept graduate students, it has had to accept undergraduates and others. And I've spent time there with the president, and so, yeah. So I think the general feeling a year in was that it was assimilating.
And it was almost prescient because the number of international students was starting to just grow and continues to grow. Yeah. And so having that extra facility and building another one, it really is an anticipation of what the future was all about.
I think so. I think it's. I think I'm sort of like some residents. It didn't really strike me fully the power of this place until I left, and running a bed and breakfast, working for my wife, was not stress-free either. But it gave a chance to look back at International. This is an extraordinary institution.
When you say the impact, it takes a while to move out of it, because it is intense. And we'll talk about this tonight. As a president, you're here almost all the time.
Yeah.
But what is that impact? Because part of the difficulty in this day and age for us, because there are international dormitories everywhere, is how to differentiate this experience in terms of its impact from others. Yeah. So what is it? You've had time to reflect on this, and you're back at the house for the first time in 20-something years.
Yeah.
What is the impact, and why is it different than other experiences?
Well, one, this is a very beautiful institution. It is treasured. It is something that you don't see in modern architecture, and this room is a very good example of it. The Dodge Room is a very good example of it. Secondly, some residents, I wouldn't say all, in fact maybe only a portion, know of the power of the leadership of this place, to be associated not only with wealth like the Rockefellers and Dodge, but to be associated with those that were committed, and particularly John J. McCloy is something. I don't think most residents necessarily focus on that, but it is a factor. Then the friendships that are established. You remember Herman Rottenberg, HR, HR would attend every wedding that he was invited to of those that met here. I think Daisy and George Soros met here. And Paul Soros met here. Many met here. Shelby Cullum Davis, Catherine met here. And until we brought them in, Catherine was a real critic of internet. We had her come and speak, and she traveled through Russia 17 times in her life, and she is given quite freely of that. I think that that bonding is important. The language tables, the opportunity to sit and hear your language, because hearing American English day in and day out for those that have beautiful Spanish or the triumphant French is hard. The cultural programs, the richness, the speakers that broaden the mind and the opportunity of interacting with speakers afterwards. Having lived at International on your CV, and if you're involved in the Harlem tutorial or you're involved in some other arrangement, having that on your CV is a door opener for interviews in the future. Being part of the women's leadership program is transformative, I think, really so. So there are many, many ways in which exercising together in the gym, we used to do that, try to keep up with these young, and I could go on, but that's...
This is perfect.
Yeah.
Joe, tell me if you would a little bit about, and you are a great president, and I'm not saying it just because you're here, but about the other presidents, because we don't have very many other people who can speak to them. But let's go as far back as you can. Did you, who did you know of the other presidents?
Well, the only ones that I knew, because I was trying to think of who. Howard came aboard. See, he stepped aside, I think, in 70. So 70, 50, 40. He came aboard in 1945, or was it 55? So 70, 60, 60, 50, yeah. So he came aboard in 45. So he was there 25 years, and I got to know Howard very well. Howard lived in Morningside Gardens. He came to the International House every day. His mail was here. His second marriage was the secretary of his office. Howard was not obtrusive. He knew his role. He, I'm sure, had thoughts about my leadership that he would not want me to hear. But he was, and I'll tell a story. We traveled, had a World Council meeting in New Delhi, and so I flew into Saudi Arabia. He met me in Tehran, and we went to Riyadh and ended up in Jeddah. And I said, and we shared rooms. I said, "Howard, you snore?" So I do not snore. So I had my tape recorder with me, and I turned it on, and I played it the next morning. And I said, "Howard, that's you." "That's not me." I said, "Well, here it is. It's you." I think where he would, well, first of all, in terms of salary, he was, I don't think he ever got more than $45,000 as salary. And I ended up at 120, which is not much when you're talking to the board salaries. And I think he always felt that he was disadvantaged in that respect. But at any rate, Howard was a fundraiser. When it was very difficult to raise money, they didn't raise much. The endowment, I think, when I arrived, was $4 million, yeah, which was not a great deal. And now it's 71 million, I think. Is that right? Yeah. So that's incredible. Thomas Olson was the interim president, and I walked into a hornet's nest. The relationship between Tom Olson and Howard Cook was not good. For example, I invited them both to meet with Henry Kissinger, and both were angry at me for inviting the other one. The deputy that Tom had chosen, I dismissed, and brought in the controller from Cairo, from the USA in Cairo, who was wonderful. Tom did not get on well with the board. You have to get on with the board. You have to be close to the board. If you lose the trust of the board, it's just like the Secretary of State. If the Secretary of State, and Rex Tillerson knows this very well, if you can't be close, and this is what John Whitehead was with both George Shultz and with President Reagan, is a real bond. And if you can't bond, I mean, Henry would scoff at how much time I was taking, etc., but he treasured International House and put up with me. Meeting with Ford was a delight. And I think the two key people that Tom did not relate to was both the chair of the executive committee and the chairman of the board. And he had this house out on Long Island that he wanted to buy. It was available, and he had gone way out on the limb, and the board did not support it. He got it cut off. How he ended up leaving, I don't know. I think probably it's like Sessions. A letter of resignation was written for him. Yeah.
How about Don Cuneo?
Well, Don, as I will say tonight, was just invaluable. I think, I'm a ex-engineer, and he was a world renowned lawyer. His specialty was dumping, of dumping trade. Everywhere I had 3 lawsuits when I arrived, including some beer barrels that were not returned. I turned them over and I said, would you take care of these? And as others said, the lawsuit from my project in Guinea, if it had ended, it occurred earlier. On purchases, for example, both the purchase agreement with Union and the agreement with the New York State Dormitory Authority, that was Cuneo. I would call, and at that time, Sherman was charging, I think, $450 an hour. And I would look at my phone and see how many minutes I had. And of course, all that was pro bono. Don first arrived at International House 40 years ago. And so he had a long association with the house. And then when he came aboard in '93, he was here 20 years. Yeah. So I would, and his mind was sharp as. So sometimes I was caught between Don Cuneo and Steve Ayer, and that is not a pincer movement that one would particularly volunteer to be in. But by and large, we had one board member that came to John Whitehead and said, this executive chair and the president, they need to go. And fortunately, John Whitehead was so wonderful as a board chair. He said, Gordon, this trustee is not one of your favorites, is he? And, so these things, but Don, I think the only issue where we might have differed, and I pushed on it, was I developed a special area for Manhattan School of Music within International House, and I don't think he favored it. And so in the board meeting, I turned to Don. I said, Don, would you explain to the board what we have in mind? I don't think he ever forgave me for that, but our relationship was close. I don't think he felt that I was any brain trust.
So I do want to ask before I forget.
Yeah.
Just back to David Rockefeller.
Yes.
And a little bit more about, this will be for the retrospective we have.
Mm-hmm.
If you can say anything about, your assessment of him, and the impact perhaps that International House had on him, because he came in when he was 10 years old.
Yeah.
And the impact he had on iHouse, and on the world, from that perspective.
Well, I, as I say, was not a close friend of David Rockefeller, and I don't think he had a lot of close friends. But I did see him a lot, and I saw him in different settings, sometimes in large groups where he was over on the other side of the wall. I think that David Rockefeller was a force in New York. I think those who, well, first of all, let me say, when he came, he was so proud that he came to International House at 10 years of age. And he was so proud that Daddy created this marvelous institution. And I really think that from 10 to 20 years, and he came many, many times, and his father was chairman of the board, I do think that this had an indelible effect on his outlook on the world and made him feel very comfortable with the world. And his grandson, David, I'm sorry, I'm talking about David Rockefeller. His son, David, when we had a luncheon, he wanted to have someone to talk about the educational system of Japan and Germany and Brazil I think I'm leaving out one country, and so the residents were there. So it came on to his children as well. Now, some of David's children, as you know, are different in terms of not having a close relationship with their father or their mother. I think that David pushed probably a little too hard many organizations that he wanted to have contribute either to Rockefeller University or maybe International House or other programs. And the relationship ruptured. I think that secretly he always wanted to be Secretary of State. And it never came about. But he was a Secretary of State with the Chase Manhattan. And he, every other year, would travel to a different part of the world extensively, and he would really intermingle. I felt sorry for him in Abidjan because there wasn't that much turnout. And the people there, Houphouët-Boigny, the president, had 12,000 French when he became president in 60, and 60,000 French when we left. And so who turned out for David Rockefeller when he was there were French, not very many Ivorians. In New York, well, Peconico Hills was important. I think it was more important to Nelson Rockefeller than it was for David. I think David established, as you know, and maintained a number of institutions, including the Trilateral Commission. And the one thing about David, commitment. It wasn't a commitment for a year, it wasn't a commitment for a few years, it was commitment right throughout. In fact, right up to the end. And when I said goodbye to him, I was on his team. I mean, he just couldn't believe that I survived for 11 years. So I never was invited into their home, either there or up the river. And so our socializing was always in larger groups.
What was his impact on the house?
Yeah, okay, so I think the issue was constancy. In other words, when he stepped down, well, he was chair, not for, I think, 5 years, maybe most, of the executive committee, but he followed it. And I'm sure he had a excellent relationship with Howard. I don't think there was any relationship with Tom. I don't know about that. And Tom was very cordial when we arrived, so I'm not critical, but he got crosswise with the board. I made it a point about every 4 months to sit with him and bring, even though he had no leadership on. I don't think Abby ever objected to that. In fact, I think she was pleased with that. And so, yes. And so I spent almost an hour with him. I couldn't get out when I went there to say goodbye. Yeah.
So, Michael, you had a couple of questions.
Sure. Gordon, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about fundraising while you were at the house. You told me an interesting story about Barbara's work as part of that. I'd also like to hear some of your thoughts on the board's fundraising while you were here.
Yes, Michael, and thank you. I'm not a great fundraiser. We had, and it's interesting, Terrell Ford, we were going to hire a contract team. He said, Gordon, I've been associated with so many enterprises. These fundraisers, one, they're expensive. Two, they tell you what you already know. Three, they have worn out all their contacts because they've been fundraising at other institutions. My belief on fundraising is that you're good for about 8 years. And if you stay longer than that, you've pretty well used up your credit with others. Barbara, my spouse, is intuitively brilliant in regard to fundraising. And any of the ideas that I had in respect to pushing various enterprises normally came from her, pro bono. and we didn't raise a lot of money. I think over the course of time, we raised somewhere between $7 and $8 million altogether. There's one very interesting fundraising event. We were on the tour that occurred in Prague. I'll say two things about the ambassador, Canadian ambassador, was our host. He had been hospitalized because he had a flare-up in phlebitis. He left the hospital without anyone knowing to host us. We traveled with a couple that were very close to International House San Francisco, Berkeley, which is also Rockefeller Institution. We went to a cathedral, St. Barbara, and my wife was very excited. On the pulpit was the name of this couple. We took their picture under, this is Barbara's idea, we took their picture under the pulpit. 9 months later, they both had passed away. They left International House New York, $1.2 million. Yeah. So here again, that's Barbara in action. She's a follow-up queen. Yeah.
She played an integral part of your presidency, isn't that right?
She was very active. In fact, she interjected during the time we were being interviewed by Don Cuneo and the search committee, and she said something, and Don said, "I'm sorry, we're hiring Gordon, not you," which she'll still remember. Yeah. And I think she was much more active than Bonnie. Of course, Bonnie had her own, well, Barbara did. Barbara taught at Spence and at Midtown Ethical Culture for up until the time she broke her ankle. Yes, she was and has been. We're in our 64th year. Yeah.
Michael, anything else?
Yeah. Gordon, I was wondering, given today's political climate, how do you think iHouse's role is evolving? Do you think things have changed, in terms of how iHouse handles political environments? What do you kind of see for iHouse in the future as it thinks about different political environments?
I think that International House and the Department of State are in the same boat, except that fortunately Calvin has all of his positions filled, which is not true at State. I'm giving a talk on that at Kendall in Oberlin this next year. So I think we're so strong and so at this era is so vital that there is an institution that is involved in a moral outreach, that is comfortable with empathy, that has a sense that leaders can go out from here and do important things in the future that many feel is dismal, but they don't feel that's dismal. They just can't wait to get into action. So I look upon it, I'm an inherent optimist, which can make you vulnerable, but an inherent optimist, and I think that what the majority, not all, but the majority of residents, when they leave here, they're truly changed.
Great answer.
Yeah. So I think that's good, yeah.
May I say one other thing?
Yes.
I want to say, because she's not here, but she's been here so many times, I want to say that Barbara, she's not in the best of health. And otherwise she would be here. But I remember we drove from Karachi, Pakistan to Kathmandu, Nepal and back, 6,000 miles. We floated our car across the Ganges River on a boat that had no motor. We drove through the heart of Afghanistan to Kabul and back. She brought in to the world 2 children in Karachi, Pakistan, at a time that was very, very sensitive. We traveled all over West Africa. She had so many friends in those 3 countries. And she has had some health issues. So that's why she's not here. But Michael knows her.
It sounds amazing.
Amazing, in spirit, right?
Yeah.
I just have one quick question. Beyond Bishop Tutu, is there any other guest speakers that really resonated with you that?
Lorette Rupe. Lorette Rupe was president of the director, I guess it was, of the Peace Corps, and she came from Michigan. Her husband was a congressman from Michigan. Lorette Rupe spoke here. Lorette Rupe directed the Peace Corps, I think, for almost the entire Reagan period, and she was a moderate, bright light. When she came, we had a display of art near the dining room that was all from Peace Corps volunteers. And I first met her in Abidjan. I met her at the airport, and I said, "We'll go this way." She said, "There's a line." I said, "Well, I know you don't have to stand in the line. We're going to get you through quickly." "Nope, I'm going to stand in line." And that was typical Lorette Rupe. When she spoke of Ronald Reagan frequently criticizing her for being so liberal. And she inherited Sarge Shriver's spirit of the Corps and was one wonderful speaker. And as you know, she got with cancer. She left this world at a young age. We had so many speakers. Of others that the corporate, the 17 of the corporate, they were each in their own right, and we have it in a booklet of those who spoke. I remember the head of J.P. Morgan being asked by a Ugandan, I think it was J.P. Morgan, "Why don't you invest in Uganda?" And this president looked and said, "Please stand. Smart money goes where it's welcomed." So, yeah. Then we had, we had George Soros. George Soros came and spoke, and I had, you interview George Soros in his office, and he had speakers all around, and those who are investing in stock will say, so-and-so is on the market, it looks as though it's down, we ought to buy in. Can we, George? Well, yeah, so I had him convinced, and he agreed to buy a floor at Van Dusen. In other words, each room would be $15,000 each year for open-ended. He spoke, he had a cold, and he wasn't feeling well, and so I sort of was with him after his talk, which was quite ennobling. And he said, "Gordon, get lost. I'm happy here with the residents." We had the architect, Stern, speak on the history of global architecture, which is something you may reconsider, or maybe you've already had him come. And he was just magnificent. He knew Robert A.M. Stern. Robert A.M. Stern, I would say, in terms of redoing Davis Hall, was 75% pro bono, at a time that his work was receding, which I gather is now blossoming. So that was Robert A.M. Stern, and he has done works all over the world. We had speakers from. I would like to make one reference to John J. McCloy, who did not speak, but we attended his funeral in, I think it was the late 80s. Did I mention this? I don't think so. And this was at a church that was packed, and the Council on Foreign Relations had set it up. Two former chancellors of Germany were there, because he was the first High Commissioner to Germany. He was also president of the World Bank. and was chairman of the board of International House for 17 years. So I call on him every 6 months over the 11 years. Well, not over the 11 years, up until the time he passed on. And his wife had developed Alzheimer's 15 years earlier. He left his office early in the afternoon. He was in his 90s, and would visit her, and she wouldn't recognize him, but he did it every single day. At any rate, at the end of the service, James Baker was representing the president. He goes out, gets in his car, 2 cars in front, 2 cars in back, booms away. Richard Nixon walks out to the sidewalk, all alone, turns left, goes down, totally unnoticed. And that always made me aware of power leadership when it ends. Yeah.
So it's extraordinary. I think, yeah. I don't know how we're going to beat this tonight, but
You'll do it.
Well, yeah.
You'll do it many times.
nothing like this. This is really tremendous.
You know why? You can't interview corpses.
That's true.
We don't have that technology.
No, we don't. We'll talk about it. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah,
This
you're
is
so welcome.
terrific.
Yeah.